Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along today. Delighted so many of you. I see the numbers creeping up to over 60, taking the time to join us. As Jenny said, my name's Andrew Greenway. I'm a founding partner in Public Digital. My colleague Jamie is on hand to help with the interactive elements of some of this session and press all the buttons for us. Just to reiterate what Jenny said about interactivity, in an ideal world, with the caliber of people on this call, it would have been great to have this as a more conversational session rather than what will end up being a wee bit of a podcast, I'm afraid. But we're going to try and bring in as many chances for you to contribute your insights and what you've seen over the past few months as well. And as Jenny says, if you do have any questions about what I say as we go through some of the presentation aspects of today, please do pop them in the chat. The link is in the Zoom call, and I'll try and get to them as I go through. So I'm going to spend the first few minutes covering a couple of fairly simple things, just a little bit about us as Public Digital and as Jenny says, defining digital. Then talk about some of the things that we've seen as essential preconditions for successful digital transformation of organisations, and then on some more practical questions that boards and senior leaders can ask of their digital transformation programmes and efforts within their organisation. Let's talk a little bit about us, just so you get to know us a little bit. This is Public Digital. You'll see Jamie looking delighted on the left there. This is a few of us sitting in now what looks like irresponsibly close proximity about a year ago. Public Digital is a small digital transformation consultancy. We're based in London, but we work around the world. And there's probably a couple of things to sort of take away from this picture, really. One is the group of people in that room represent a lot of different disciplines and backgrounds. So you've got coders in there, designers, strategists, service designers. The man in the suit and tie on the right is obviously the procurement expert, it goes without saying. And the people in that room have spent quite a lot of time in government in particular, but also have experience in retail and media, a little bit of healthcare, banking, the charity sector as well. So the point, I suppose, is that the people in that room and us as an organisation have a lot of lived experience of digital transformation. Be that in the public or private sectors. And we have a lot of scars on our back, it's probably fair to say, from doing this ourselves. So we tend to spend quite a lot of our time in practice effectively telling people about our mistakes, sharing our war stories, and helping them avoid make the same ones that we make. So that's what I'm planning on spending quite a bit of time on today. And just to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of organisations that we've worked with in the past, this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but you'll see a bit of a mix in here. Governments in several continents, some large companies as well, the likes of the Co-op and HSBC, and we've partnered with organisations like the UN, Harvard Kennedy School, and a few others. What I'm trying to do in less than 90 minutes is distill some of the experience from working across a very diverse group of organisations down into something that's as useful as possible for you. It's obviously impossible to do justice to everything, so I've selected sort of some of the stories that are hopefully most relevant to you as within your organisations, and also hopefully most interesting from the perspective of sitting in an NHS trust. And quite a lot of the stories are going to sort of draw on probably what we're best known for as a group of people, which is the work that we did for the UK government before we set up Public Digital. Many of us were involved in setting up the Government Digital Service in the UK, based in the Cabinet Office. That was back in 2011. And GDS, the Government Digital Service, really kind of did a couple of things, if you're going to boil it right down. We redesigned a lot of digital public services and delivered gov.uk, amongst other things. And I suppose the less celebrated element, or the less kind of public element, was we began to break the kind of the big IT dependency that the UK government had rather locked itself into over a period of several years. And in terms of headlines, we like to think we did a lot to improve the user experience of many government services, not all of them by any means. There are certainly a lot of places where that could do with a bit more help. And along the way, we saved quite a lot of money. 4.1 billion is a big number, even in government. And I mention that purely as clearly in these times, pulling off the trick of getting better for less is going to be very high on many senior leaders' minds. And digital transformation does really offer an opportunity to deliver that. The obvious next question is, what did the digital in government digital service really mean? And it's worth saying that one thing that it didn't mean for us was, it didn't just mean technology, and it didn't just mean IT. And this was quite an important thing for us to push back on in many ways, partly because it's such a common conflation of terms. Lots of organizations tend to think of digital as IT and equate the two. And kind of more importantly, in some senses, they also tend to assign responsibility for them accordingly as well, giving digital brief to a single executive and often a CIO to worry about. And I think the thing to kind of, if you take nothing away from the rest of this session, it's to remember that while technology is absolutely a part of the picture in terms of digital and digital change, it's really only one part. And actually, surprisingly often, it's not actually the most important part. So the definition of digital that we use, and effectively this is the sort of the boiling down of the scars on our back, is this one, which is applying the culture, processes, operating models, and the technologies of the internet era to help meet people's, help respond to people's raised expectations. And the point here is that technology is without question important, but to achieve the transformation that any organization will need to thrive in the internet era, there's actually quite a lot more going on. And the culture, those processes, and the kind of the form that the organization ends up taking are equally important considerations. I think the penny has dropped for many organizations, but digital is clearly much more than putting manual or paper processes online. And one of the things I think, if you consider that to be your definition of digital, makes quite clear is responding to the consequences of that kind of change are actually a job for the whole organization, and in particular, the whole executive team. And delegating it to one executive or one particular team, or indeed one set of skills, or to give you the worst possible answer, one consultancy, tends to get people into trouble. I'm sure many of you on this call, if not all of you, will have a horror story in mind of a big IT or big technology project failure that you'll have heard about, or maybe had a passing involvement in. And many of the most kind of storied big IT failures that I've seen across all sectors are things that tend to have collapsed because they were given to the IT department or one big supplier to worry about. The rest of the organization just sort of washed their hands of it. There are many examples of these, but just to kind of pick out one from away from these shores. Obamacare, which I'm sure you'll recall, not that long ago, although in political terms it feels like several lifetimes ago, but was President Obama's, that administration's flagship domestic policy, this kind of insurance scheme for covering at least 20 million additional Americans with healthcare. And healthcare.gov, sort of the federal health exchange, essentially the website that was supposed to be the front door for applications, was an outsourced, technology-led, waterfall-driven, proprietary mess. It fell over fairly spectacularly, forcing this rose garden apology from the president. Did a lot of harm to the policy's credibility, and ended up costing them a good deal of money to fix. Now, clearly the technology failed in that case, but I think it would be wrong to characterize it as a failure of technology. It was actually a failure of organization, a failure of working practices, failure of culture, and ultimately, really, it was a failure of leadership. And one of the many things that did go wrong in that was that too many smart people focused on the words and the policy, but actually the reality of delivery was lost. And the point is that whether we like it or not, design, code, the nuts and bolts of digital delivery are as important as policy and services now, and you separate them at your peril. And what this means for you and for your kind of fellow leaders is that digital is a collective responsibility for trust leadership. Everyone on the board will play a role in making it happen, or indeed making it not happen, either by delivering it or almost as importantly, and perhaps even more importantly in some senses, in creating the organizational culture, the processes, and the operating models that allow it to be delivered. Or indeed, for some of the non-executives that I understand will be on this call too, in helping the executives provide the day-to-day leadership needed to create those organizational conditions in which the teams delivering new services and new ways can thrive. It's a point that's sort of worth making here, that quite often people will look at the sort of the giants of the web, the Amazons and the like, and kind of sort of say, well, could or should we be like that? And I would argue that the point of trusts going through digital transformation is not to copy the web giants. There are many very good reasons not to do that. But what it is about, it's about adapting to be able to better respond to the new opportunities and threats. Amazon, Spotify, those kinds of organizations deal with the needs of 2020 by using the culture of 2020 and the processes of 2020, and indeed the technologies of the internet era too. Those are conditions that are intrinsic to the way that they set themselves up and the way that they structure themselves, their operating model. They support scale, they support flexibility, and they support agility as well. The NHS comes from a very different place with a very different history, culture, and context. But it still has to deal with the needs of 2020. Often it has to do that using the culture and the processes that are maybe several decades old, the technology too in a lot of cases. But updating that technology alone isn't going to fix that. It's going to require that much wider view on the operating model of the trust. And just to return to the definition briefly, the final clause of that definition is really important as well. I think it helps explain why digital change is so important, and perhaps why now it's even higher on the agenda than it maybe was 1, 2, 3 years ago. Our expectations of what's possible in terms of services have been completely transformed by the web. We've come to expect the convenience of an Amazon or an Airbnb or an Uber as pretty much standard. We don't see that stuff as magic. 20 years ago, we would have seen that as utterly magic. Now it's just what we expect. And the public sector is different, objectively so in some senses, in that it doesn't face the same existential threat that digital creates in the private sector. It is not going to fall foul of the same forces that did for Kodak or Toys R Us or Blockbuster or a number of companies that you could name over the last 5 or 10 years that bit the dust as a result of digital disruption of their business model. But equally, people aren't going to see any reasons why public services shouldn't be as good as the ones they get privately. And those expectations will not expect anything other than parity. And that's, I think, especially important now, and has been brought perhaps into even sharper relief by the events of the last 3 or 4 months. The expectations of what is possible within the NHS have been raised again, I think, thanks to the response of the last 3 months. Now, it's important to acknowledge that that's a response that's been founded on extra money, extra time invested, and focus as a result of the crisis that we've been in, but also new processes and ways of working, and very different incentives acting on individuals, and different cultures taking roots in different places. And what's been particularly interesting is already we've seen, I think, a lot of trusts adopting new ways of working in the last few months, or almost without noticing it. The tenets of what you would expect in an Amazon or a Spotify, the starting small, the working iteratively, the closing the gap between the clinicians and support staff, the focusing on outcomes more than systems. And there's been an incredible acceleration of digital adoption in the NHS over the past few months, not least in response to the pandemic. But I think it's important not to over-egg it. What has been effectively, in some cases, the forced adoption of technology that was already sitting on the shelf, ready to go, is not the same as the hard human work of transformation, that kind of real underpinning how the organization lives and runs and thinks. But in any case, the expectations of patients and service users and staff are not going to go back to where they were before the pandemic, before the changes that we've seen. And I'm quite skeptical about the phrases of new normal or returning to business as usual, because what we've seen over the past few years, irrespective of what's happened over the last 4 months, is that the bar will keep increasing. It will keep going higher and higher for everybody in terms of what people expect of their services and what's possible if you use the sort of technologies and ways of working in the digital era. And that will be true even as the pressures of this summer and indeed this winter will impress on the system. So I'm going to move on to the next section of the presentation and start talking a bit more about some of the preconditions, if you like, of successful digital transformation and where you kind of need, what you need to get started successfully. And before kind of getting into that, I should probably start with the bad news, which is that there's no secret shortcut to successful digital transformation, really. The truth about successful digital change in every sector, public or private, central government, healthcare, retail, banking, whatever, is true of most successful change, full stop. They're kind of the same as a good magic trick, really. A lot of the hard work has already happened before the trick even gets started. And to extend the analogy further, what you need to do to complete the trick tends to either be a mixture of some sleight of hand or some fairly hard, unglamorous work that happens in the background on scene. So what are the kind of the things that you need to set up that magic trick? What do you do to get to that point? And what are the things that you'd ideally have in place if you're going to embark on a program of successful digital transformation of your organization? Well, I think there are 4 things that are really helpful, roughly summarized here. So the first is some board level leadership. The second is a team that can deliver. The third is a goal and a mission. And the fourth is a crisis, or because, I spent quite a lot of time in the civil service, we prefer to describe that to the ministers as a window of opportunity. Let's start with leadership, given the people in this room. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the leadership story behind the government digital service. So these 2 characters were ultimately fundamental to getting that organisation started. The chap at the top is now Lord Maud, but at the time was just Francis Maud. He was the Minister for the Cabinet Office. And the woman in the photo below him, you may recognise another person who's been ennobled since she took up the digital champion role. Whether those things happened in parallel is not for me to say. That is Baroness Lane Fox, or Martha Lane Fox. Those 2 played a critical role in kind of particularly the early days of the digital transformation of the UK government. And they played a slightly different role as a pair. Martha, as an internet entrepreneur, having set up lastminute.com and various other successful internet businesses, was the person who offered the vision and the credibility of having been there and done it and understood the territory very well. She saw what was possible, even in an organisation as hidebound as government. Francis played a slightly different role. Francis offered the political clout, sort of the decision-making position, and the respect of his political colleagues. Now, clearly within this particular context, these were sort of political or pseudo-political figures. But really, in other realms, what we're really talking about is senior executives who can bring a combination of vision and authority to this agenda. Another kind of good example, a more recent one, albeit another one from government, is this chap. This was President Macri in Argentina. He was the top politician in Argentina until quite recently. And he was a good example of the kinds of leadership that he ultimately are required to drive this kind of change through large, complex, often legacy organizations. He was willing to spend his political capital. He was willing to be the bad cop, if necessary, to say no to things. And a theme that we'll come back to again later on in this session is that actually stopping things is almost as important as starting them in terms of successful digital transformation. He was a figurehead for change. He was willing to stand up and kind of be the kind of the clear spokesperson for this as an agenda, one that's often not been something that senior executives have felt comfortable doing, seeing IT as a way of losing their job, frankly, rather than a way of reforming their institution. And he was about using his authority, really, and platform to elevate the teams that he had below him to deliver things and get things out of their way. Effectively a form of servant leadership, really. But it's worth saying in terms of these leaders that, with the exception of Martha, just about, neither of these people were technologists. They wouldn't feel entirely comfortable with coding themselves. But they were technology curious, and they recognized the need for their whole leadership team to be equally curious and actually to be intolerant if they were not. And a lot of this facet of leadership that's required is being able to kind of have the vision and belief that digital and technology should be part of a strategic conversation about the direction of an organization. The challenge, I think, that many CIOs tend to find in lots of organizations is they're sort of relegated to the tactical and operational rather than really being elevated to that kind of strategic point. So as well as the kind of the right leaders, people who are willing to spend their political capital, are willing to engage in digital and technology as a sort of strategic force for institutional reform, you need doers, you need a team. We find ourselves using the phrase that you need a mandate and a movement quite a lot in terms of successful digital transformation of organizations. And in our experience, it has to be something that comes from the bottom up as much as it is driven from the top down. This photo shows a selection of some of the team, the GDS team, Government Digital Service team, and Aviation House. This was about 2 years in. Now, the first thing you'll notice and go, I'm not sure that kind of fits, is that there's a lot of people in here. There weren't a lot of people to start with. In fact, there were about 6. And it's probably also worth noting that not all of these people were there to build things. In central government, we did quite a lot of building our own stuff. We had teams that were building websites and building services. Trusts will operate in a different context from that. But the ingredients that are in this room are going to be similar for all organizations that are going through some form of digital transformation, whether that's building their own services or procuring them and buying them more effectively. This is a highly multidisciplinary group of people. There are people who are developers, who are designers, who are user researchers, policy experts, the equivalent of clinicians, I suppose, in the civil service. And having these kinds of skills put together in an empowered team that works across the silos of an organization is key to sort of driving momentum and getting things done. The other thing that you'll kind of notice in this kind of picture is that there's cake and there's bunting and there's badges and post-its on the walls. Now, it's easy to kind of make fun of these things, and you can really, it's all a bit silly, but it's also, they're important cultural proxies. They're important signals of new ways of working. If you'd shown that picture to someone and said, this is a group of civil servants, they wouldn't really believe you in 2010. There was no way that kind of looked and sounded a bit like this. And that's quite important. And one of the challenges, I think, for leaders trying to embark on digital transformation is that there will have to be some sort of recognition that you will need to introduce some new cultures into your organization, some new ways of thinking. And that is often quite a difficult thing to protect and integrate with your organization. But it's really important to sort of drive those kind of new perspectives. Someone's just put a really good question in the chat, which is about having poor diversity inclusion in this picture. That's absolutely correct. I think it was one of the things that actually the Government Digital Service did not do particularly well to start with. And I think one of its early failures was that it didn't have a workforce that was as reflective of the population that it was trying to serve as it should have done. It has significantly improved over time with that, as it recognised that that was a weakness. But I think it's an extremely good point. Digital and technology tends to be heavily white, tends to be disproportionately male, certainly tends to be disproportionately middle class. And GDS over time got significantly better at that, but initially I fully kind of acknowledge, and that photo kind of indicates that it was further behind. One thing that it was doing, though, was I think it was sort of challenging a broader monoculture within the organisation of Whitehall. That was a diverse group compared to the kind of the wider senior civil service, unfortunately, but nonetheless, it could have been a lot better. The other thing that I'll say about teams that's worth sort of touching upon is that good digital teams will tend to be a mixture of the existing and new skills. That's really important. I think one of the things that people often think about when they think about digital transformation programs and projects is one of two mistakes. They either think we can do this with everyone we already have in the building. But I think that's very difficult. I think that's very difficult to do that when you're steeped in the organizational needs and organizational culture to kind of break out of that. And it's also very tempting to think, oh, well, we can just bring in the kids in jeans. You know, they'll kind of come in with the t-shirts and kind of shake us up a little bit. And both of those get you into a fairly inadequate place. You need to have a blend of both. You need to have people who bring brand new skills, brand new perspectives to an organization, who can challenge the kind of the orthodoxy and the status quo. But equally, you need people who truly understand the business, in inverted commas, who understand why things are the way they are. We had a kind of a bit of a mantra in terms of when bringing people into the digital team, that we wanted to find the angry people. The people who were already within the organization, who knew what things were broken, but also knew where the answers are. And frequently they were the people on the front line who kind of knew what the workarounds and the hacks were and knew how to fix things that were broken processes, but they just sort of sat together with bits of sellotape. They've been looking for a better answer to that question for a while. This photo shows a couple of people from GDS. On the left is a woman called Kathy Settle, who couldn't have been more steeped in Whitehall if she tried. Before joining the digital team in the UK, she was in charge of civil contingencies, so would have been very busy if she was still in that post now, essentially running the central response to emergencies. On the right is a chap called Neil Williams, who is exactly as he looks, a kind of proper internet era product manager, who's dressed up to go to number 10. And the point is that the organization would have been infinitely weaker without both of those perspectives, both of those backgrounds, and both of those skills. The third sort of precondition that's worth sort of touching on is a clear mission and a clear goal. Now, this sounds a bit like a strategy, and it is in some ways. But when you hear strategy in the context of digital and technology, the mind tends to turn to very long slide packs or documents, which everybody kind of broadly agrees with, but no one can quite remember what they say. By mission, I mean having a very clear, meaningful and understandable goal. Something like, you know, it's a bit cliche, but Kennedy's "we shall go to the moon," rather than the kind of the abstract verbs and nouns that all too often end up passing for an organizational vision. But for GDS, this was ours. Create a team to build ourselves effectively. Fix publishing, so that was fix the presentation of information the government wanted to get out to people on the internet. Fix services, so fix some of the transactional end-to-end services like some licenses and tax and some benefits and things like that. And then go wholesale, so be able to do that at scale. That's 9 words that covered comfortably more than 5-6 years of work at least. And the real virtue of them, whether we achieve them or not, and in some cases we probably did, in some cases we definitely didn't in entirety, the virtue of it was people remembered them and people understood them. And it gave them some orientation about how far along the journey that we've got. And the sort of temptation with a mission like this and setting this for a kind of digital transformation program is to sort of either underspecify, which leaves you with that sort of word soup where no one can quite determine whether you've succeeded or not by the end of it. Or you end up over-specifying and forcing yourself into making lots of predictions about the future that really can't be anything more than guesses. And I don't particularly like the cliche of an elevator pitch. I mean, who's getting in an elevator these days? But a good mission and a test of a good mission is a bit like good advertising, really. It's sticky. It's sort of exciting. It's something that attracts people to take a closer look and ask questions. In many ways, your mission is kind of your recruiting strategy too. Most strategies aren't like that. But just having one of those isn't quite enough. Writing a big picture mission is difficult, but what can be equally hard is generating that first boost of momentum towards achieving it, really building that sense of progress and belief that can be done through delivery. And for that, it's really helpful to just have the herding power of a simple, clear goal. For us in GDS and the UK government, it was this: we're going to ship the nation's website. We're going to shut down the 1,800 odd other sites, and we're going to do it on date X. And the virtues of this is very clear. It's pass or fail, effectively. It's big, but it's achievable. And this is very important. It doesn't mean that once you've shipped it, you've finished. To this day, and gov.uk was launched in 2012, so we're talking nearly 8 years on now. Scores of improvements are made to that site on a weekly basis. It wasn't finished when it was published, but it gave us a clear milestone and a clear sense of something that we could point at to demonstrate this was a new way of working and a real sense of progress. Some of the trusts I know have already got these kinds of goals and these kinds of missions. I've heard of trusts talking about becoming a work from anywhere organisation, for example, and I think that kind of unifying clarity is really helpful. But one other thing that's worth saying about goals is, ideally, and one of the reasons why we started with gov.uk, is the goal also implicitly has something where you've turned the old stuff off. One of the challenges, as I kind of alluded to before with digital transformation, is people see it as a sort of largely about building the new, finding new stuff, producing shiny things that one can point at. But as I'm sure all of you are acutely aware, the sort of the dilemma that every organisation, and certainly every trust faces, is dual running to some extent, is maintaining the old and the legacy while building some of the new. And over time, if you just build new and don't turn off old, you accrete complexity, which actually tends to negate all the benefits that you're trying to achieve from doing this, the sort of the savings and efficiencies, the clarity of user experience, and so on. So a good goal in an ideal world is where you switch something off while creating something new. Another facet of a good goal is that it's something that's relatively high profile, but relatively low risk. gov.uk was big and it was visible, but if we failed, then it would have been embarrassing, but it wouldn't have been the end of the world. Over time, we got more involved in unpicking and redesigning services that were fundamental to national security, but starting there, as they say in Yes Minister, would have been courageous. We got there in the end, but we started with something that was relatively bounded and relatively safe. And the final condition that's particularly helpful for generating change is not wasting a good crisis. As I say, in the private sector, the threat of competition and disruption provides quite a lot of that. But the marvellous thing about the public sector and governments is that there's forms of crisis pretty much wherever you look. And it's usually just a case of choosing whether to harness it or not. For GDS, this was our crisis. We were spending a lot of money. The government wasn't getting a lot for it. And we had a fairly destructive relationship, I would say, and codependent relationship with the technology market. A point that's been raised in the chat around the structure of markets and technology markets around software and consultancy and so on. I wholly agree that kind of interplay between public sector organizations and the technology market is what drives quite a lot of the unusual behavior and not necessarily ideal outcomes. That was our crisis in the UK at that point. We've got a rather different one now. And this image did the rounds on the internet pretty early on in the pandemic. And I think it illustrates the point. Many organizations have started to do things that they've ignored or maybe resisted for years in favor of inertia, which is no longer really an option. Now, this is an exhaustive list of preconditions. You need some luck, you generally need some money, and you need some institutional alignment as well. This is where the crisis bit often helps. And in a couple of weeks' time, as Jenny said at the top, we'll be holding some follow-up sessions where we'll be spending a bit more time reflecting on some of the changes that have happened as a direct result of some of the coronavirus pandemic and what's happened over the last few months. So the final section, and I'm going to go quite quickly on this because this is a good talkative group, which is excellent. So I'd like to talk less and let you talk more. So I'm just going to touch on 8 questions, I think, that I think that have been quite useful for boards to kind of get under the skin of their digital transformation programs in terms of finding out how well they're going. It's quite difficult, I think, to tell as a sort of senior leader in an organisation when things are going well and when they're not, unless it's clearly true one way or the other. Given the lack of bandwidth that many leaders have, as was kind of mentioned in some of the comments earlier, during one of the most challenging periods that the NHS will face, being able to get under the surface quickly is probably more important than ever. The sort of just very quickly, it's worth knowing that the sort of the genesis of these questions actually came from a conversation that myself and a couple of colleagues had with a Canadian minister. He's no longer in the job, but I shouldn't really name him. Anyway, he was kind of essentially saying, look, I get lots of requests for huge sums of money for these IT technology projects. I get the kind of the status reports. I've got no idea what's going on. Can you just give me a one-page anti-nonsense guide for trying to get under the skin of these things so I have a sense? So you're getting a version of those questions. That is the point of these, really, just to sort of a shortcut to try and cut to the quick. The first question is very simple, which is, there's that word again, sorry. Can you see what people, or indeed your patients, service users, or your users are experiencing? Now, I say users partly because it's a catch-all term for lots of different groups, so we don't get stuck on one particular type. But the point I'm making here is the single biggest difference that genuinely digital organizations achieve is becoming entirely centered on the people they are supposed to be serving. But depending on the industry, substitute various terms for those people. But either way, the point is that they make decisions based on what those people need, not what the organization needs. And as an executive or as a non-executive, one of the ways of getting to kind of under the skin of that is demanding to get the closest fidelity to that kind of actual experience of people using your service, demanding to see prototypes of services, making visits, getting as near to that real experience as you can. This is a problem particular to governments, but I think also challenging for leaders in all kinds of organizations, which is many executives have grown extremely good at discerning what is really going on from reading the papers. But it can still only get you so close, particularly in terms of digital services. One of the more unpopular things that we did in the UK government was include a line in the budget which said that ministers have to test any new digital services before launch, which ministers were perfectly happy about, because they had several scores of constituents moaning at them in constituency surgeries that the online services the government was providing weren't working properly. Civil servants were not so happy with that idea. But actually getting close to that experience, really kind of passing what people are feeling and seeing and looking at when they're going through the service is really, really important. If it's on paper, you can't necessarily be sure that translates into reality. Another very simple one, which is who's doing most of the talking. And this kind of returns to a point I was making earlier about digital being a collective responsibility of leadership. If the board discussions on digital are led solely by the CIO, you should probably ask questions about that. Equally, if it's led solely by the strategy director, you should probably ask questions there too. If the CEO is unusually reticent and he or she wouldn't be on another topic, that's also worth looking at. This, by the way, is a picture of a man called Carlos Rodriguez Pastor, who's the only billionaire I've ever met face to face. He runs a company called Intercore. Intercore is a company you may not have come across. They're a very large conglomerate based in Peru. They've got banks and retail and hospitals and schools and all sorts of things. They account for about 4% of Peru's GDP. And Intercore was getting stuck with its digital transformation, partly because there wasn't true executive ownership of the agenda. So one of the things that Carlos insisted on was that every CEO of those sort of 25 businesses within the group would learn the basic technical architecture of their business and present it back to their peers, so their fellow CEOs, in a month's time. And his reasoning was pretty simple. If you don't understand the technology, at least at some basic level, if you don't have that degree of curiosity about how your business runs itself, then you don't understand your business. And he's right. And incidentally, after this exercise, a couple of the company's CIOs got the boot because they couldn't explain it to their CEO without consultants in the room helping them along the way. But the point, again, is this idea of executive ownership. It's not just the plumbing. This is intrinsic to how you run your organization and the constraints that it puts upon itself, or the flexibility that it allows itself. It needs to be collectively owned and to some extent collectively understood. That doesn't mean that everybody on the board needs to be the expert in the room, but they do need to be able to engage with it on a level as they would with finance, for example. Third question, which is a little bit left field, or relatively left field, so I'll unpack it a little bit. I've read quite a lot of digital strategies over the sort of past few years. There's nothing especially special about good digital strategy versus good strategy. It should be pithy and concise and based on evidence from actually delivering stuff rather than hopeful guesses about the future. But most importantly, and we touched on this in the previous section, it should be selective. Digital strategies really quite often end up as shopping lists. There's a bit of AI there and some machine learning here and some agile here and lots and lots of work streams. And if you're doing everything, you ultimately won't do very much. And you will have that kind of understanding clarity gap that we touched upon before. Clearly ruling things out and explaining why you're ruling them out is really important. And I know I've talked about the UK example a fair bit, but when we made gov.uk and a couple of fairly simple services, the sort of the first big steps of our digital strategy there, we had a lot of people saying, yeah, whatever, it's just a website, or online petitions isn't really life or death, is it? And that's fair enough. But our view is that you've got to start small and simple and fast and clear and use those early kind of signs of progress, signs of change to build momentum, build credibility, because there's an enormous amount of fatigue amongst executives and people throughout organizations, change management fatigue. It's like, I've had a lot of change management, I've not seen a lot of change. So building that momentum, building that credibility, building that learning and understanding of what works and what doesn't, and what works for certain groups and what doesn't. Then you can move on to the things that are highly complex. Again, the universal credits, the things that are material to national security and life and death. Skipping to the end of that movie from the start tends to create false certainty and quite a lot of false hope, and helps contribute to that sense of change management fatigue that I touched upon that earlier. So being clear about what you're not doing and why can be really, really helpful, as much as what you are doing. The fourth question, and this is one that, again, kind of people sort of sets people aback a bit. A developer I used to work with in a government department regularly used to say, I could build this thing in the time that it takes to arrange the meetings for us to agree on whether we should build this thing. And that's not just bravado, actually. That's generally true. If you put together the right sets of skills in a team, give them some space, give them that mission and a mandate, and they can generally deliver far, far quicker than the speed of governance, certainly the speed of most public sector governments. And actually, we've seen that. We've seen that in the pandemic. We've seen that in the response of many trust teams all over the country, I think. But equally, you and your board members, and indeed the people that you're who are relying on your services, should be able to see the difference in weeks rather than years. And I think because of what has happened to IT and technology over the past couple of decades, many executives have kind of got used to the idea that your general typical IT project is a year's worth of a big business case, 3 years of silence and crossed fingers, and then hopefully something that's all right at the end. With kind of more agile delivery teams, you should be expecting live, minimum viable products, not finished, constantly iterated, but you should be seeing services tested with real people in weeks and improved iteratively thereafter based on what you learn from that testing. It doesn't work with everything, but it can work with a lot of things, and particularly things when there's a great deal of uncertainty. And when people are involved in using services, there's almost always a great deal of uncertainty. If all you're seeing after a few months is sort of status updates and more paper, you should probably be getting a bit spiky. This particular example is the petition site I mentioned. This was originally out for a 2-year procurement. in the end, we ended up building a beta in 12 weeks. And yes, this isn't a life or death service or anything especially complicated. But again, it's about starting small. It's about building teams, learning about people's needs. And those are the muscles that organizations will need to build in order to put the whole organization in a stronger place to deal with the big stuff like EPRs and the like. And that kind of brings me on to this question, which is whether teams are trusted to experiment with their ways of working. You don't get that kind of pace, that delivery in weeks and days even, rather than months and years, by working in that kind of more traditional waterfall style project management silos. Now, to be clear, and there's an awful lot of zealotry about agile and waterfall, and it's all very silly. Waterfall is perfectly suitable for a lot of things, well understood, well-controlled environments. There's a reason why it became a sort of project management orthodoxy. It's very useful for lots of things. But equally, with quite a lot of things, it's not. And to get pace, teams will need to be given that clear goal and trusted to get on with delivering it, trusted to overcome blockers and challenges they find along the way. And they'll need to experiment, not just with what they're producing, but how they themselves are working, so they can kind of correct course quickly. And they need to be able to fail fast and fail cheaply. And the idea of failing is so countercultural in organizations because we got used to failure in the public sector, partly because of how we fund and how we kind of project manage. Generally tends to be so expensive in time and money to do. If you're working in a more agile initiative way, you should be able to throw away things very cheaply and very quickly. And being able to encourage people to take small bounded risks is really important. The pictures that I've got on the screen there are just a very quick example from Ontario, where the Department of Health there had a service, which is essentially a formulary search, so the drugs that were available through various different types of private insurance. It was one of the most kind of used bits of functionality on the site. It was a horrible PDF search thing, didn't really work, didn't really help people, to the point where it actually generated quite a lot of cost because people would look up their drug, be confused by the site, ring up the department and say, I don't really understand. Can you tell me whether I can get this thing or not? And a team in that department said, well, we can do a lot better than this. Can we build something? It's very simple. Can we build something to improve this? It won't take us long, won't cost much money. And the department said, great, of course you can. We've got a space on our project prioritization board in 6 months' time. Can you come to that? And they said, well, I think we can do a bit better than that. So they built it over a weekend. It was the thing on the top left, nothing particularly clever, just a sort of a nice sort of skin over a PDF, really, over a database rather. And they showed it to the deputy minister, so the sort of permanent secretary equivalent of the department, who himself was a former pharmacologist. So he knew his stuff, and he put it through its paces. And it worked. And the point being that if you have a culture that allows people to experiment with those new ways of working, you will find that there are benefits quickly, not just in terms of the services that they're able to deliver, but also the fact that it can persuade people that having a suite of different approaches to managing projects and products can deliver far more in terms of tangible results than just having one rule to rule them all. Very quickly, last 3 questions. One of the things that is the sort of the flip side of the coin with experimentation is you can end up with a lot of small experiments. And actually, they only take you so far. If you have a lot of kind of digital experiments that are sitting on the kind of periphery of your day-to-day business, they're not really changing your organization. They're just sort of a bit of tinsel really on the side. And the real art is kind of finding things that can scale, that can kind of work, that can be integrated in the kind of the business as usual of your organization. Lots of organizations get stuck in an innovation trap, really, with lots of mini projects that make for really good case studies, but never really touch the edges of the real business. And they end up losing momentum and support. Scaling successful experiments is probably the hardest thing to do in digital transformation. Gov.uk Notify is quite a good example of this success. It's a kind of simple bit of messaging functionality that you can plug into lots of different services. And there's 2 secrets in scaling, and neither of them are particularly appealing, but it's worth knowing. One of them is something that I talked about earlier, which is turning things off. In order for the kind of the new solutions to overtake the old, you sort of have to take the old away to some extent. But the other, and probably more kind of crucial, is that to have experiments that work, you need to do lots of experiments. Every kind of bet on particular sort of digital services and digital platforms is a bet. It may not work. You may learn that the right thing is not to pursue this any further, to stop it. And again, I think we've got used to this idea that we put so much effort into a business case where we make some hopeful guesses about the future, that once we've written the thing, we kind of have to do it because we've invested so much time and effort in writing the business case. Whereas actually, ideally, we'd be able to spin up quite a lot of experiments, learn what the kind of the right solutions are in a sort of more practical, real sense more quickly, rather than just a purely analytical one. Couple of final questions. One of them is sort of touches on the point that was raised a bit earlier in the chat, which is around the market that exists around this, which is a kind of huge shaper of some of the behavior that exists in all organizations, but particularly public sector. I mean, it's no surprise to you, I'm sure, that lots of technology companies and consultancies have been in an unusually generous mood since March, offering all kinds of exciting solutions and things to all kinds of organizations. And again, this won't be a surprise, I'm sure, to anyone on this call, but a good general rule is that if anyone is offering you a solution without a pretty intimate understanding of the context and problem that you're facing, they may not always have your strategic interests at heart. The "oh, but other trusts are doing it" argument as well should be treated with quite a lot of skepticism too. Now, I am not saying, to be clear, that there isn't a lot of value and a lot of good people and good answers in those firms and in that market. And in fact, one of the things that where they can be of great help is helping you to understand the problem and the context more clearly. But if they purport to have the answers without really understanding your organization or indeed the people who you're serving, your users, for want of a better shorthand, I would treat those offers with quite a lot of skepticism. Because the uncomfortable truth of quite a lot of digital transformation is that in many cases, the biggest leaps in improvement that are kind of felt by people will often come from really still very basic technology, if technology at all. It'll be better written letters, better text messages, simple design patterns, mobile responsive websites. You probably won't need any blockchain, at least not for quite a while. So treating those gifts with the kind of the politeness they deserve, but also the skepticism, is well worth bearing in mind. And finally, but very importantly, particularly given the people on this call, there's the obvious point that your organization won't be the first to embark on the process of digital transformation, and nor will it be the only one in the NHS. Looking sideways to what your neighbouring trusts are doing, to what's already been done and shared by central initiatives. This is the NHS's Service Design Manual, for example, run by NHS Digital. It could save you a lot of time and a lot of money. Now, that's not to say that you'll find all the answers there. But I think through sessions like this and peer learning sessions such as the ones to come in a couple of weeks, but also a variety of other forums and things, there's certainly a way of avoiding reinventing many wheels or indeed making identical mistakes to others. And what that should do, hopefully, is give you the opportunity to make some new mistakes. And when your organization does and learns from them, you should be setting the expectation that your organization should be contributing that learning back into the ecosystem for others to draw upon. Now, there are only 8 questions there. You can conceivably ask hundreds. These don't go down into the details of digital skills, which is a theme that we picked up a bit in the chat. Lock into supplier contracts, doesn't talk about data, and so on. There's lots more. But others, and we've found that the answers to these 8, or some combination thereof, start to paint a collective picture of an organization's digital maturity and digital confidence. And they helpfully open up more doors for other pointy questions to be asked about leadership, about capability, about procurement, recruitment, legacy technology, and so on. Program. But just to finish up from me, thank you all again very much for coming and listening this afternoon. I really appreciate you taking the time on what is an extremely busy time. And as I say, very grateful for your contributions and for your tolerance of the virtual environment. And thank you for taking part. I'll hand back to Jenny to wrap us up. Thanks.